War did not begin for Winston Churchill with the roar of bombers or the march of armies, but with a quieter, more dangerous realization that brute force alone would not defeat Adolf Hitler. As Europe collapsed under the weight of Blitzkrieg, Churchill understood something many of his contemporaries did not yet grasp. This war would be won as much in shadows as on battlefields, as much in whispered agreements as in artillery barrages. Britain stood isolated, battered, and vulnerable, and survival itself depended on invisible lines of influence stretching across continents. Behind the public image of defiance and rhetoric lay a far more delicate operation unfolding in private rooms, encrypted cables and carefully chosen intermediaries. Churchill inherited a world where alliances were brittle, old empires were cracking, and neutrality was often a mask for quiet sympathy toward Berlin. The true battlefield extended into foreign ministries, royal courts, exile governments, and even enemy capitals. Every conversation carried the potential to tilt history, or to doom Britain entirely. The Prime Minister's greatest fear in 1940 was not simply invasion, but abandonment. France had fallen with shocking speed, leaving Britain exposed and alone against a German war machine at its zenith. The United States remained officially neutral, the Soviet Union bound to Hitler by a cynical pact, and much of the world uncertain whether Britain could even survive the year. Churchill knew that if Britain appeared weak, hesitant, or diplomatically isolated, the war would be lost without a final shot fired. What followed was not a single grand diplomatic maneuver, but a web of overlapping, often contradictory efforts. Some official, many deliberately deniable. Churchill encouraged back-channel contacts while publicly denouncing appeasement. He authorized emissaries to speak softly where his speeches thundered. This duality was not hypocrisy, it was strategy. Survival required flexibility, even deception, and Churchill was willing to accept moral ambiguity if it bought time and leverage. One of the most critical fronts lay in convincing neutral nations that Britain's defeat was neither inevitable nor imminent. Spain, Turkey, Sweden, Portugal, and even Ireland became arenas of silent contest, where German pressure was countered not with threats, but with promises, trade concessions, intelligence sharing, and subtle manipulation. These nations were not passive spectators. Each calculated its own survival, weighing the risks of defying Hitler against the dangers of aligning with him too closely. Churchill understood the psychology of power. He grasped that Hitler's greatest weapon was not merely military strength, but the perception of unstoppable momentum. To counter this, Britain had to appear resilient, resourceful, and connected, even when it was exhausted and overstretched. Diplomacy became a form of theater, carefully staged to project confidence outward while concealing desperation within. The human cost of these decisions weighed heavily. Secret diplomacy meant dealing with unsavory figures, tolerating morally compromised regimes, and sometimes sacrificing smaller nations' interests to preserve the greater war effort. Churchill was haunted by these choices, yet he rarely hesitated. He believed history would judge results, not purity. The alternative, he felt, was annihilation. As bombs fell on London and invasion plans loomed across the Channel, the true struggle for Britain's survival was already underway, quietly shaping alliances, delaying enemies, and preparing the ground for a global coalition that did not yet fully exist. The turning of the tide against Hitler would not begin with a victory parade or a decisive battle, but with a series of unseen decisions that kept Britain alive long enough for the world to change. Churchill's hidden diplomacy deepened as Britain fought for mere existence, because time itself had become a strategic resource. Every week Britain remained in the war altered calculations in foreign capitals. Churchill pressed this reality relentlessly through indirect channels, allowing neutral leaders to see Britain not as a doomed remnant of a fallen Europe, but as a stubborn fulcrum upon which the future balance of power might still turn. Endurance became persuasion. Portugal was among the earliest tests of this approach. Bound to Britain by the world's oldest alliance yet fearful of German retaliation, Lisbon balanced uneasily between cooperation and silence. Churchill quietly revived centuries-old commitments, not with legal arguments but with personal messages and economic assurances. British diplomats emphasized Atlantic security, trade continuity, and the long-term danger of German dominance. Slowly, Portuguese neutrality bent just enough to allow Britain access to critical Atlantic bases, a concession that would later shape the Battle of the Atlantic. Spain posed a far greater danger. Franco owed his victory in the Spanish Civil War to Hitler and Mussolini, and German pressure to join the Axis was relentless. Churchill authorized a complex mix of inducements and deterrents, financial incentives, promises of post-war reconstruction support, and subtle reminders of Britain's naval power over Spanish supply lines. British intelligence funneled funds to stabilize the Spanish economy, not out of generosity, but to prevent desperation from driving Franco into Hitler's arms. Turkey, guarding the gateway between Europe and the Middle East, became another focal point. Churchill recognized that Turkish alignment with Germany would threaten British oil supplies and open routes for Axis expansion into the Caucasus. Through patient diplomacy, Britain supplied arms, shared intelligence, and treated Ankara with respect as a sovereign power rather than a pawn. Churchill's approach contrasted sharply with German arrogance, slowly anchoring Turkey's neutrality closer to Allied interests. Even Ireland, officially neutral and deeply scarred by its history with Britain, demanded careful handling. Churchill restrained hardliners who demanded coercion, understanding that forced compliance would only deepen resentment and risk pushing Ireland toward quiet cooperation with Germany. Instead, Britain tolerated neutrality while quietly coordinating on security matters, protecting Atlantic approaches without inflaming nationalist opposition. Behind these efforts lay a deeper strategic insight. Churchill knew that preventing Hitler from gaining new allies was as vital as winning new ones. Each neutral country kept from the Axis denied Germany resources, ports, manpower, and legitimacy. Hidden diplomacy was defensive as much as it was expansive, designed to contain Nazi influence while Britain rebuilt its strength. By late 1940, these quiet victories did not yet resemble triumph. Britain was still under siege, still alone in arms. Yet beneath the surface, Hitler's diplomatic momentum had begun to stall. The map was no longer sliding inexorably toward Berlin, and in that subtle shift lay the first signs that the tide might one day turn. While neutral Europe absorbed much of Churchill's attention, the most consequential diplomatic courtship lay across the Atlantic. The United States held the industrial and financial power capable of transforming the war, but American public opinion remained wary of foreign entanglements. Churchill understood that formal diplomacy alone would not suffice. He needed to shape perception, emotion, and narrative inside the American mind. Churchill's correspondence with Franklin Roosevelt was deliberately personal, intimate, and urgent. He wrote not as a distant statesman, but as a fellow custodian of democratic civilization. These messages bypassed bureaucratic stiffness, framing the war as a shared moral struggle rather than a British imperial concern. Roosevelt, constrained by isolationist sentiment, responded cautiously, but the bond between the two men grew steadily stronger. Behind the scenes, British diplomats and intelligence officers worked tirelessly in Washington, New York, and beyond. They cultivated journalists, academics, and politicians, feeding them carefully framed information about Britain's resilience and Nazi brutality. This was not crude propaganda but narrative alignment, subtly encouraging Americans to see Britain's fight as their own future battle fought early. The Destroyers for Bases agreement emerged from this climate of trust and necessity. Britain received desperately needed naval vessels, while the United States secured strategic bases in the Atlantic. Publicly framed as mutual defense, the deal marked a decisive erosion of American neutrality. Churchill celebrated privately, recognizing that the agreement tied American security directly to Britain's survival. Economic diplomacy followed. Britain was nearly bankrupt, its gold reserves drained by years of war purchases. Churchill accepted dependence as the price of survival, supporting arrangements that would later evolve into Lend-Lease. Though it bound Britain to American material power, it also bound America to Britain's fate. From that moment, a British collapse would represent an American strategic failure. Churchill also understood symbolism. He ensured that American visitors witnessed bombed cities, determined civilians, and functioning institutions. The message was clear: Britain was wounded but unbroken. This visual diplomacy carried weight no speech could match, reinforcing the argument that aid to Britain was not charity but investment. By the end of 1941, the United States had not yet formally entered the war, but neutrality had become increasingly hollow. Churchill's patient, calculated diplomacy had transformed America from distant observer to indispensable partner. The Atlantic relationship, born in secrecy and necessity, was becoming the backbone of a future alliance that Hitler could no longer ignore. As Churchill courted allies, he also confronted a deeply uncomfortable truth. Defeating Hitler might require temporary cooperation with regimes whose values Britain fundamentally opposed. Nowhere was this tension sharper than in Britain's evolving stance toward the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had stunned the world, and Stalin's collaboration with Hitler repelled British opinion. Yet Churchill refused to let ideology obscure strategy. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Churchill acted with startling speed. Within hours, Britain extended support to Moscow, not out of sentiment but calculation. Hitler had opened a vast new front, and Churchill seized the opportunity to bind German forces in the east. He publicly set aside past condemnation, recognizing that survival demanded alignment with necessity. Behind closed doors, diplomacy with the Soviets was cautious and unsentimental. Churchill trusted neither Stalin's intentions nor his promises, but he understood leverage. Britain offered aid, intelligence, and recognition, while quietly insisting on Soviet commitment to sustained resistance. Mutual suspicion defined the relationship, yet necessity forced cooperation. The Arctic convoys became both symbol and substance of this alliance. Britain risked ships, men, and resources to supply Soviet forces, demonstrating tangible commitment. These convoys were diplomatic messages written in steel and blood, signaling to Moscow that Britain would endure hardship to keep the Eastern Front alive. At the same time, Churchill maintained back-channel communications to ensure that Stalin understood Britain's limitations. He resisted Soviet pressure for premature invasions in Western Europe, explaining logistical realities while promising eventual action. This balancing act prevented a rupture that might have led Stalin to seek separate terms with Hitler. The alliance reshaped global strategy. German resources were stretched, plans disrupted, and assumptions shattered. Hitler had gambled on a quick victory in the East, and Churchill's diplomacy ensured that gamble became catastrophic. The war was no longer a two-front illusion but a grinding, global struggle. Though deeply uneasy, Churchill accepted the moral ambiguity of cooperating with Stalin. He believed that history would judge harshly any leader who allowed ideological purity to doom civilization itself. The alliance was not born of trust but of necessity, and necessity, Churchill believed, was the ultimate law of war. Churchill's hidden diplomacy extended beyond governments to movements without states, exile leaders, resistance networks, and displaced elites scattered across occupied Europe. These figures possessed no armies, yet they carried legitimacy, local knowledge, and the promise of post-war stability. Churchill understood that the war's end was already being shaped even as its outcome remained uncertain. London became a hub of exile governments, each with competing claims and grievances. Churchill navigated these tensions carefully, offering recognition and support without committing to rigid post-war boundaries. He knew premature promises could fracture Allied unity, yet outright dismissal would alienate those risking their lives under occupation. Support for resistance movements was calibrated, not romanticized. Churchill authorized aid, training, and coordination while resisting calls for large-scale uprisings that would provoke brutal reprisals without strategic gain. Diplomacy and intelligence intertwined, ensuring resistance efforts aligned with broader Allied objectives rather than isolated heroism. Churchill also understood the symbolic power of recognition. By treating exile leaders as future partners rather than powerless refugees, Britain preserved political continuity across occupied Europe. This legitimacy would later prove essential in restoring order after liberation, preventing power vacuums that Germany, or chaos, might exploit. Relations with colonial territories added further complexity. Britain's empire provided manpower and resources, but nationalist movements watched the war closely, questioning whether British promises of freedom were sincere. Churchill's diplomacy here was cautious, often postponing reform to maintain wartime unity, even as pressure mounted. These decisions carried long-term consequences. Churchill prioritized defeating Hitler over reshaping imperial structures, believing that survival came first. Yet even this conservative approach required careful diplomatic messaging to prevent unrest from undermining the war effort. By weaving together governments in exile, resistance networks, and imperial commitments, Churchill constructed a political architecture that extended far beyond Britain's shores. It was fragile, imperfect, and morally complex, but it ensured that when military momentum shifted, there would be political structures ready to replace Nazi rule. As the war intensified, Churchill's diplomacy increasingly merged with deception. He understood that misleading Hitler about Allied intentions could save lives and shape outcomes. This was diplomacy weaponized, not to persuade allies but to confuse enemies. Information itself became a battlefield. Through double agents and controlled leaks, Britain fed Germany carefully crafted falsehoods. Neutral embassies, commercial contacts, and even humanitarian channels were used to transmit misleading impressions of British weakness or misplaced focus. These efforts were designed to exploit German assumptions rather than invent implausible fantasies. Churchill approved these operations personally, aware of their risks. A single failure could expose the entire network. Yet success meant strategic advantage far exceeding any single battle. By influencing German expectations, Britain could dictate where and when strength would be applied. Diplomatic deception also reassured allies. By presenting a unified front, publicly confident, privately coordinated, Britain sustained coalition morale. Appearances mattered. Allies needed to believe not only in Britain's resolve, but in its competence as a strategic leader. This approach reached maturity as planning began for future offensives. Diplomacy shaped the environment in which military decisions would land, ensuring that when force was finally unleashed, it struck where Germany least expected. Churchill never romanticized deception. He saw it as grim necessity, justified only by its potential to shorten the war. Each success reinforced his belief that wars were won not only by courage, but by imagination and patience. The hidden war of messages, silences, and misdirection continued relentlessly, unseen by the public yet decisive in its effects. Hitler, confident in his own brilliance, increasingly mistook British subtlety for weakness, a miscalculation that would prove fatal. By the midpoint of the war, the cumulative effect of Churchill's hidden diplomacy had transformed the strategic landscape. Britain was no longer isolated, no longer reactive. It stood at the center of a growing, if uneasy coalition whose combined weight would eventually crush Nazi Germany. The tide had not yet fully turned, but its direction was now unmistakable. Every alliance, every neutral held back, every deception planted had narrowed Hitler's options. Germany faced stretched supply lines, hostile seas, and enemies coordinating across continents. This was not the result of a single decision, but of years of patient, often invisible effort. Churchill's role was not to dominate allies but to bind them. He absorbed slights, conceded ground, and endured criticism to preserve unity. His diplomacy was not elegant, but relentless, driven by the belief that fragmentation was Hitler's greatest ally. The human dimension remained ever present. Letters from diplomats, reports from occupied Europe, and casualty lists reminded Churchill that every delay cost lives. Yet haste could be deadlier still. His diplomacy sought the narrow path between urgency and recklessness. By shaping relationships before victory arrived, Churchill ensured that success, when it came, would be sustainable. The war would not end in chaos but in negotiated order, however imperfect. This foresight distinguished strategy from mere reaction. The hidden nature of this work meant it would rarely be celebrated. Battles captured headlines, diplomacy changed maps quietly. Yet without these unseen efforts, military success would have been impossible. As Allied power gathered and Germany's strategic errors multiplied, the foundations laid by Churchill's hidden diplomacy began to bear visible fruit. The war's outcome was no longer a question of survival, but of timing, and the balance had shifted irrevocably against Hitler. As Allied strength expanded, Churchill's diplomacy evolved from survival-driven maneuvering into the architecture of victory. The focus shifted toward coordination, aligning vast military, industrial, and political forces into a single, if often strained, direction. The challenge was no longer simply keeping Britain alive, but preventing the alliance itself from tearing apart under the pressure of scale, ambition, and distrust. Tensions with the United States deepened as American power surged. Churchill welcomed this strength but feared strategic impatience. American planners favored bold, direct action, while Churchill urged caution, shaped by Britain's earlier wounds. Behind closed doors, he labored to reconcile these differences, framing delays not as hesitation but as preparation designed to save lives and preserve momentum. The Mediterranean strategy became a focal point of this debate. Churchill viewed it as a means to exploit Axis weaknesses, protect imperial lifelines, and maintain pressure while building toward a decisive blow. Convincing American leaders required persistent persuasion, data-driven argument, and appeals to shared long-term interests. Diplomacy here was as intense as any battlefield engagement. Simultaneously, Churchill managed relations with Free French leaders, whose pride and internal divisions threatened unity. Supporting French legitimacy without empowering instability required delicate balance. Churchill offered recognition while resisting efforts to force premature political settlements that could fracture Allied command. Churchill's diplomacy also extended to managing expectations. Smaller allies demanded faster liberation, greater resources, and clearer post-war assurances. Churchill acknowledged their suffering while emphasizing the necessity of coordination and sequencing. Every promise carried consequences. Every delay risked resentment. The burden of leadership grew heavier as success approached. Churchill understood that coalitions are easiest to form in desperation and hardest to maintain in ascent. Victory sharpened disagreements rather than erasing them. Hidden diplomacy now focused on preventing success from becoming its own undoing. Through relentless effort, Churchill maintained cohesion. Not by eliminating conflict but by containing it, absorbing pressure, redirecting frustration, and keeping the ultimate objective in sight. This quiet labor ensured that Allied strength accumulated rather than dispersed as the endgame approached. As planning for a return to Western Europe accelerated, diplomacy and deception merged into a single, immense undertaking. Churchill recognized that the coming invasion would not succeed on military strength alone. It required absolute surprise, precise coordination, and the sustained belief, among enemies and allies alike, that Britain remained unpredictable. Diplomatic channels became conduits for misinformation. Neutral governments, commercial networks, and even humanitarian organizations were carefully monitored, their communications subtly shaped to reinforce false impressions. Germany was encouraged to expect attacks where none would come, to fear threats that existed only on paper. Churchill supported these efforts with unwavering commitment. He understood that credibility was the cornerstone of deception. Every diplomatic gesture, every public statement had to align with the illusion being constructed. This demanded discipline and restraint at the highest levels of government. Relations with the Soviet Union grew more complex during this period. Stalin pressed relentlessly for a second front, suspecting Western delay was intentional. Churchill worked to reassure Moscow without revealing operational secrets, emphasizing shared sacrifice and eventual convergence. This diplomatic tightrope was essential to prevent mistrust from undermining cooperation. At the same time, resistance movements across Europe were quietly repositioned. Diplomacy ensured their actions complemented invasion plans rather than exposing them prematurely. Courage was abundant, coordination was indispensable. The scale of preparation required unprecedented trust among allies. Churchill invested heavily in maintaining that trust, even when disagreements flared. He believed that a fractured alliance would be more dangerous than a delayed assault. When the time came, Germany would face not just an army, but a carefully crafted narrative, one shaped by years of hidden diplomacy, designed to paralyze decision-making at the critical moment. Victory would depend as much on confusion as on courage. The liberation of Europe brought not relief, but new diplomatic peril. As Allied forces advanced, questions once deferred surged forward with urgency. Borders, governments, justice, and reconstruction demanded answers. Churchill understood that how victory was managed could determine whether peace endured or collapsed into new conflict. In liberated territories, provisional authorities required recognition, resources, and restraint. Churchill urged caution, fearing that revolutionary fervor could destabilize fragile societies. His diplomacy sought continuity where possible, believing stability was the foundation of recovery. Relations with the Soviet Union grew increasingly strained. As Red Army forces occupied vast territories, Churchill worried that military success would harden into political domination. He intensified diplomatic engagement, seeking clarity, assurances, and limits, often receiving ambiguity in return. The famous wartime conferences became arenas of subtle struggle. Churchill navigated these meetings with a blend of charm, firmness, and realism. He pressed British interests while acknowledging the shifting balance of power, aware that Britain's influence depended on persuasion rather than command. Churchill's diplomacy now faced moral reckoning. Decisions made in secrecy during the war would shape millions of lives. He wrestled with compromises he had accepted, knowing some would haunt Europe for generations. Yet he remained pragmatic. Churchill believed imperfect peace was preferable to perfect ruin. His aim was not ideal justice but preventable catastrophe. The shadow of another war loomed constantly in his calculations. As the guns fell silent in some regions, Churchill's hidden diplomacy continued unabated. Victory did not end the struggle, it transformed it. The battlefield had shifted from trenches and skies to negotiating tables and emerging borders. With Germany's defeat approaching, Churchill confronted the reality that Britain's wartime role would not translate seamlessly into post-war dominance. Diplomacy now required adaptation to diminished power. He sought to preserve influence not through force, but through relationships forged under fire. The Anglo-American partnership deepened even as interests diverged. Churchill worked tirelessly to keep Britain relevant in strategic decisions, emphasizing experience, continuity, and shared values. He framed Britain as bridge rather than rival, linking American power to European recovery. Europe itself lay shattered. Churchill supported early steps toward cooperation, understanding that fragmented recovery would invite instability. His wartime diplomacy had taught him that isolation bred disaster, Interdependence, though messy, offered hope. Colonial pressures intensified as wartime promises echoed back from distant territories. Churchill resisted rapid dismantling, fearing disorder, yet recognized that the old imperial balance was eroding. Diplomacy became defensive, seeking managed transition rather than abrupt collapse. The legacy of secret agreements weighed heavily. Some allies felt betrayed, others felt abandoned. Churchill faced criticism not only from former enemies, but from partners who believed their sacrifices warranted more. He accepted this burden as the price of leadership. Despite fatigue and political pressure, Churchill remained engaged. He believed that abandoning diplomacy at victory's edge would squander everything earned. Peace required as much vigilance as war. The hidden diplomacy that had sustained Britain through its darkest hour now sought to anchor a fragile world order. Its success would be uneven, its compromises enduring, but without it, chaos would have reigned. As the post-war world took shape, Churchill reflected privately on the unseen battles he had fought. Many of his most consequential decisions had never appeared in headlines. They existed only in archives, memories, and altered destinies. This invisibility troubled him less than the alternative, a world shaped solely by force. The emerging divide between former allies confirmed his fears. Wartime unity dissolved into suspicion, and Churchill recognized familiar patterns returning. Diplomacy once again became the front line against catastrophe. He drew upon wartime lessons: patience, leverage, narrative, and restraint. The same skills that had delayed defeat were now required to prevent renewed conflict. History, he believed, did not move forward, it circled. Churchill's warnings grew sharper as his influence waned. He understood the cost of ignoring diplomatic signals, having lived through their consequences. His experience lent weight to his caution, even when political power slipped away. The legacy of hidden diplomacy lay not in perfection but in survival. Britain had endured not because it was strongest, but because it adapted, connected, and endured long enough for circumstances to change. Churchill accepted that future generations would judge his compromises harshly. He believed they should. Yet he hoped they would also recognize the conditions under which those choices were made. In the quiet aftermath of war, the true measure of diplomacy revealed itself, not in triumph, but in what disasters had been narrowly avoided. Looking back, the turning of the tide against Hitler appeared inevitable only in hindsight. At the time, each decision balanced on uncertainty. Churchill's hidden diplomacy did not guarantee victory, it preserved possibility. Every neutral persuaded, every ally sustained, every enemy misled reduced the odds stacked against Britain. These were incremental gains, rarely dramatic, yet cumulatively decisive. Churchill's greatest strength lay in understanding that war was a human endeavor before it was a military one. Fear, pride, trust, and ambition shaped outcomes as surely as weapons. He treated diplomacy not as ceremony, but as combat by other means. Words became weapons. Silence became strategy. This mindset allowed Britain to fight beyond its material limits. The cost was immense, morally, politically, personally. Churchill carried these burdens privately, convinced that leadership meant absorbing pain so others could endure. The hidden nature of his work ensured it would be misunderstood, simplified, or ignored. Yet its impact rippled through every battlefield victory that followed. History would celebrate generals and soldiers, rightly so. But beneath their triumphs lay a web of decisions made in shadows, where defeat had been postponed until victory became possible. As the world moved forward, the lessons of Churchill's diplomacy remained embedded in its institutions and alliances. The war demonstrated that isolation invited aggression, while engagement, even flawed, offered resilience. Churchill's approach reshaped how Britain saw itself, no longer sole enforcer but essential partner. This humility, born of necessity, became a strategic asset. The alliances forged in desperation evolved into frameworks for peace, however imperfect. They bore the imprint of wartime compromise and hard-earned trust. Churchill believed that diplomacy must never be passive. It demanded imagination, courage, and willingness to act before certainty arrived. Waiting for clarity, he knew, often meant waiting too long. His hidden diplomacy did not end conflict, but it altered its scale and direction. It transformed collapse into endurance, isolation into coalition. The war's outcome validated his belief that survival depended on flexibility as much as strength. Rigid certainty had doomed Hitler. Adaptive strategy had sustained Britain. These lessons echoed long after the guns fell silent, shaping a world still struggling to balance power and principle. In the end, how Churchill's hidden diplomacy turned the tide against Hitler was not through a single moment, treaty, or triumph, but through sustained effort under impossible pressure. It was the art of refusing surrender when defeat seemed logical. Britain survived long enough for allies to gather, enemies to overreach, and history to shift. This survival was not accidental. It was engineered through patience, persuasion, and calculated risk. Churchill's legacy lies not only in speeches or victories, but in the unseen labor that kept doors open when walls were closing in. He fought time itself, and won just enough of it. The tide against Hitler turned because Britain remained standing, connected, and credible. Diplomacy made that endurance possible. War rewards those who understand that power is more than force. It is perception, relationship, and resolve. Churchill grasped this when few others did. The world that emerged from the conflict bore scars of compromise and sacrifice. Yet it existed, a testament to choices made in darkness. In that survival, and in the fragile peace that followed, the quiet victory of hidden diplomacy endured, unseen, imperfect, and decisive.